Hi, I'm David with TutorLead, and welcome to another Digital Workplace Updates video from the last month or so of Microsoft 365 updates. A lot to cover here, and I think there's a whole slew of ones that will apply to a very large audience. So I'm really excited to go through some of these things that surprisingly were released so quickly after Ignite. So great to be here, and thank you for joining us.
TutorLead is a remote-first company based out of Canada.
What makes a world-class Microsoft 365 intranet and digital workplace?
One of the biggest announcements at Ignite, which was Loop. And while we did have the Fluid Live components previously and we knew about them, having them rebranded as part of this larger vision of Loop was really exciting, and I think it got a lot of really good reaction from Ignite. And one of the obvious questions was, when can we start using this? And a lot of people didn't know that these were actually already there in a lot of environments. So you will want to check that in your own and see if you can start using these, even if they're still under the old name of Live Components. Really, it's the same type of thing that we're talking about when we're talking about Loop. So you can start using these in meetings, and that's something we've done internally and found them really useful when we're trying to get information from a lot of people all at once. So definitely check this out, and that way you can get kind of that early peek into at least one part of the larger Loop vision. Now, moving from Loop into SharePoint, I come from the SharePoint universe myself, so I'm always excited when we have a lot of great SharePoint updates, and often we don't. Often we see more focus on Teams and Viva and other things. But the last month or so, we have seen a lot of changes, and many of them meaningful for SharePoint users. So the first one is a simple one and revolves around publishing and editing. And if you're creating pages, you're certainly working with the text web part, and you may have found it very frustrating. One of the main reasons for that was that the toolbar for that text web part was so limited, and I think even a lot of people didn't even know the full gamut of possibilities that were available in the text web part because they were hidden and had to be opened via that blade or that panel on the right-hand side. We now see more of the options available to us right within the toolbar, which adapts itself to the type of screen orientation you have. And we can start to do a lot more in here, including even inserting images, which is quite recent. So this is something I hope is just the tip of the iceberg, and we start to see an even better and richer text editor, because I know a lot of people are struggling with the limitations in putting text together. Now, another thing, but this is quite subtle, is just adding some visual cues into the publishing experience to make it a little bit easier on editors to know where they are on a page and what sort of action they're performing. So, subtle cues like border, just to tell us where we are, what we're hovering over, and even identifying the name of the web part, which I think is always useful. I really appreciate the fact that the navigation auto collapses now when I'm in an editing experience, because you really just didn't need that, right? When you're editing, you're focused on the page at hand, the task at hand. The navigation was just eating up useful space. So that was a really intelligent move, and something I appreciate every day. A more surprising change for me was how quickly they decided to refresh the Suite launcher again. It felt like this was not that long ago that we were looking at a new rebranding refresh on the left-hand side, and I was actually quite happy with it. But ultimately, Microsoft's narrative going forward, and you see that through Loop and Teams, is that the application should not matter. What should matter is the content. We should not have our users having to worry so much about where they are. Just focus on what they need to do. So I get where they're going. I totally understand the philosophy here. This is a refresh that's much more oriented towards content rather than the applications themselves. But for me, it's just a bit of a change and something I haven't really got accustomed to yet. So time will really tell here if this is going to be something that I'll start to use. And with that toolbar change, we also see a refresh of the page itself. Again, much more focused on recommendations and content, and much, much less on the applications. One thing I love talking about is navigation, and more on the team site side, but there are certain cases where it might apply on the communication site side as well, is where you have team sites that have a lot of document libraries. And often we struggled with the available navigation options, which were essentially creating a parent document node in the navigation and listing all the libraries below it or something of that vein, right? Now we're seeing an interesting way that Microsoft is introducing to move between libraries when you're on a given site. And it's a little subtle. I don't know if everyone will know what this means immediately, but once they do, it could be very powerful, and it could completely change the way we create our navigational structures in a team site. So for example, I'm on a site called Northwind Ideation Team here, and there's a couple document libraries attached to this site, and I can quickly flip between them just with this green library icon based dropdown, which is very simple and very easy. So this is very interesting. I'm excited to see how people react to this, and it could, like I said again, change the information architecture approaches for our document libraries in the future. Another interesting addition to the library and lists experience is having the ability now to use modern lookups. If you're familiar with lookups from traditional classic lists, you know how powerful they can be, where you have a repository of information that you want to reuse. And in a given other list, you might want to reference that information. And using a lookup was always the best way to do that, but it was not something we really had a good option for in the modern experience, and that's one that we're finally seeing resolved. So in general, I think what we're seeing with lists and libraries is any remaining functionality that needs to be modernized. We've seen this with the term store and those types of columns in the past, and now with lookups, they're getting modernized and brought up to a new, better level of support and a better user experience in general that's more aligned with the rest of our SharePoint experience, right? So this one is one that is great to see, and one that now I think makes power users a little bit more powerful going forward. In terms of audience targeting, one of the great features that we're seeing roll out into more and more places across SharePoint, and it was in the navigation or has been for a while, was the ability to target links to different groups. The challenge was we couldn't use the very popular dynamic groups from Azure, which was a challenge because one of the things that the dynamic groups do for us is they allow us to set a rule set for managing the members of a group and let the system take care of managing the removal or addition of members that meet those criteria. This was a great way to reduce administrative load on Active Directory management, which has been a pain point for many, many years for every organization I've spoken to. So not being able to leverage those in key places like targeting was a big gap, right? It was a hard sell now to say, well, these groups are great, but we can't use them in a lot of critical places. So glad to see that we're seeing that improve and we're able to use those now in targeting scenarios. In terms of SharePoint, the new SharePoint built on Stream, we are seeing now the ability to generate on-demand captions, which is great. So if you have a video in a OneDrive or SharePoint and you want to create an English caption file for it, right now it seems to be limited to English, you can do that after the fact, which is great. And anyone that has edit permissions on the video should be able to generate that caption file. Once that caption file is in place, other people can leverage it, use it, and make use of that kind of transcription that is in place. The file can also be deleted if it needs to be after the fact, but it's really just an obvious thing that's really nice to have, and just being able to generate that when we need it rather than all the time automatically is nice flexibility. Now let's talk a bit about Microsoft Search. Microsoft Search is a crucial piece of the digital workplace and has seen constant improvements to where it is today, but one of the gaps that remained was it was always challenging to get feedback from users about what they're struggling with. So a lot of times you had to rely on anecdotal or very incomplete data to try to explain what was going on and why people were unhappy with Search. The problem, or the way I always saw the problem, was the fact that you have to make that feedback very easy to provide. Just like when you get surveys for feedback after talking to almost any company, you find that if it doesn't take you just 10 or 15 seconds, you're unlikely to do it at all. So you needed that kind of quick, easy, and in the vein of where you're working approach in place, and we just didn't have that. Now we do, it's subtle. We do have a feedback button here when you're doing a search. So here I've searched for something, I know it exists, but I haven't found it. I can click on feedback. I'm prompted for what kind of feedback I want to provide, which is extremely helpful for reporting purposes later. And then I can provide my comment quickly. I could do this in 10 seconds and click submit, and I've forgotten about it. The real power of this, of course, lies in the aggregation layer, where administrators of search can now see the aggregated feedback across the board. And now they have much better data and much more agency in fixing problems that might be solvable. An amazing addition that went, somewhat unnoticed because it was easy to miss was the fact that we now can add SharePoint-based verticals to our search experience. Previously, we could add verticals, but they had to be of very specific data sources, and SharePoint, surprisingly, was not one of them. So if you had a lot of great content in SharePoint, but there was, a targeted, scoped piece of content, or targeted, scoped type of content is the better way to describe it, that you really wanted to filter to and apply to a specific vertical, you could not do that. So now, just using good old KQL, if you're familiar with result sources, you've already done this. You can craft a pretty straightforward or even a fairly complex query and apply it to your vertical, and then basically offer that vertical to your users. So here, it could be all the policies that are classified as policies in my organization show up in this dedicated vertical. Now, is this going to be a full-fledged policy center right now for every company? No, probably not. But there are a lot of scenarios that this could be really, really helpful. And having that ability, using existing mechanisms like KQL and the content where it already resides in SharePoint is extremely, extremely helpful. Now let's talk a bit about Viva. Viva is kind of its own thing right now, so I've created a section for Viva-specific content, and really here I just wanted to share a couple interesting, intriguing updates around Viva Connections and the dashboard web part. So the dashboard web part I've talked about before. I'm definitely a fan of the direction here, making a card-based designer available to the masses, and have that serve a spectrum of use cases from very basic linking to something much more complex, and may even involve integration with third-party systems. So as we've seen the dashboard in place in our environments for a few months now, we've definitely seen the types of dashboard cards that we can create has started, starting from just web link, which was all that was there initially, to a lot more, including Teams apps, approvals, assigned tasks, so some of the built-in functions. And I recently noticed that the card designer made an appearance in my tenant, so I was eager to play with it to see, how hard was it for someone to create a card, and what kind of capabilities could we do without a real developer, because that's not me. So what I did is I took a stock widget as a scenario, because that's one many organizations look at. And you can see that it's quite simple for the most part to kind of decide how you want to design the card. You have some choices in terms of size and layout. You can choose the title and the iconography, and of course, upload your image. You can then decide whether you want to use just a single button for an action or even a couple buttons for actions. So for example, the first button may generate a preview of something, whereas the second button might want to launch you right to that full experience. That's a common use case that we see. So for example, here with stock, I wanted to preview the quick view of a stock price, where the secondary button was more going to be used for seeing a full, much more deeper historical information about the stock price. And what I did, just as a proof of concept, I didn't actually pull in live data for this, but I used the adaptive card builder that Microsoft has, and one of their samples is stock. They have a sample payload of data. It's not live data, but what you can do is come in here, in this case, select the host app and make sure that it's set to Viva Connections. And then you see at the bottom that you have the payload in JSON that you can just copy and paste back in, if I go back to the previous screen, into this section on the right-hand side. And all of a sudden you have an experience that you can start to show people as, hey, would this be of interest? Is this a good idea for us? Is this the type of place where we want to store these types of things? So I definitely like where this is headed. It still requires some development for sure, like in this case, to create that live link with a stock provider. But you start to see the potential of where this framework can go. Looking at Teams here, there's always some updates to share. Definitely love the order of raised hands. I spoke briefly to this in the Ignite video. If you didn't see that, I definitely recommend you go back through that. There were a million great updates from Ignite. But just wanted to revisit this one because we're starting to see a bit more visual around this from Microsoft. And right now you can just see here it's straightforward, it's simple, it's not complicated, and it's not hard to understand. If you're ever on a call and you have a lot of people raising their hands, traditionally you want to try to address the first person if you can. But previously we really had no way to know the order of the hands being raised. So this is nice. I think a bigger change that is, for me, hugely important is previously we had a very limited search experience in Teams. It was nothing like, nothing near as good as the Microsoft search experience we would see surfaced in places like OneDrive and in SharePoint. I'm so glad to say that we're seeing now a much improved and much more aligned search experience in Teams, which looks very familiar now. It's basically pulling from a lot of the patterns that Microsoft Search is using elsewhere. So it's much more consistent and therefore much more helpful as well. I found previously that I basically tried to avoid at all costs searching in Teams. I just found it really clunky and you had to do a lot of scrolling. Now we're seeing a better use of the space. We actually have some filtering abilities. So here, if I done a search for a word and I click on, I'm actually not seeing what I expected in these first three, I can click more messages. And then you see I have a whole filter bar. So I can hide things like posts from apps and bots if there's a lot of that in your environment. Or if someone had mentioned me first, that might really help me find that content more quickly. So this is a really, really important and really crucial experience change as we're pivoting more and more towards using Teams as a kind of the surface layer for a lot of our content. We also see support for things, again, pulling in from Microsoft Search that we always wanted to see in Teams, like Q&A, acronyms, and other types of answers that we can set up in the search administration. So here, I can do the same thing I would do in SharePoint if I'm struggling with an acronym that I know our company uses and we have a search definition set up. I can now access that in Teams. It makes perfect sense, but previously that was not available. A couple tips that I'm just going to shamelessly steal from Microsoft, but they're good ones. I use the Control F1 quite a bit when I find that I'm in a channel or a team already and I want to search within the context of that team. Unless you do Control F, it won't prepend the search with your context, but if you do Control F before actually starting to do the search, you'll find that it will insert kind of your current context as part of the query, and then you can start typing. And I find that for myself, most of the times that I'm searching, I have a general idea of where I need to look. So I'm already in that channel probably looking for that content. I haven't found it immediately. Control F, and now I can search and find the results specifically from that channel. Of course, you can do a broader search if you need to, but this is helpful in those scenarios. And there's some other tricks here that are based on KQL at the bottom. If you want to search for things from a certain person, I use that quite a bit because I know I knew it was from Eddie, but I can't remember what channel we had this conversation in. That kind of thing can be really helpful. Now let's look at lists, which, is somewhat of a standalone, although I still always think of this as SharePoint lists. But now that, we have its own branding and we have some of that, it's sometimes useful to separate it out. So for lists, there was an interesting kind of innovation or announcement done where they shared that they're moving more of the applications towards what they're calling progressive web apps, which are more highly performant and offer a whole host of features that people will want. So Microsoft Lists is the first one that they decided to tackle with this new approach. And one of the things you'll see if you have a very good eye for detail is if you open Microsoft Lists in Edge, you might see this small prompt that's saying there's an app available. And you can install this, and it's not a true full-fledged Windows application. It's basically creating a mini web app for you, but it has a few advantages. It creates its own window with its own icon in the taskbar, which is really useful if you're like me and you already have way too many tabs open in your browsers. But on the back end, it's also creating a whole host of amazing new features for us. one of the things that it's doing is it's making these applications and the data within them much more performant. So we can do a lot more with them and not worry about things like throttling. And another really crucial one is we can do things like offline editing. Hooray, right? So this is amazing. So, we could do that with documents with OneDrive Sync, right? Where we could, hop on a train where we don't feel like we want to pay for the Wi-Fi and we're working offline. And when we get back online, we know that OneDrive will try to update and reconcile our changes with the version in SharePoint. Now we can look at doing this with lists as well, which is a key data source for a lot of companies and a lot of collaboration scenarios. So this is incredible to see. It's a logical extension of what was already there, but it was a big gap. So I like this a lot because it now makes it easier again to push people towards lists as a great repository for information. Again, with some caveats, there are caveats, but this is one of those that we can remove from that conversation. Now, just on the miscellaneous side, I'll include the fact that there is a new feedback portal for Microsoft 365 that's replaced the old SharePoint user voice. This is built, I believe, more from the ground up from Microsoft and not based on an existing platform, which I think Microsoft was eager to do, kind of stretch its legs a little bit and offer kind of its own solution to this problem. And so I'd encourage everyone to share their feedback, right? We always ask our clients to share feedback with us, and Microsoft is no different. I mean, the strength of their products is a testament to all the good feedback that they've received over the years. So this is a great new portal for that. Experience is pretty good. It's not all that different, but it has changed, its location. So just wanted to call that out. And for those of you a little bit confused that this looked a bit different, this is the reason why. So make good use of this. And that's it for this month's worth of updates. Thanks again for joining me, and hope that you found some little nuggets in here of interest, and look forward to our next chance. Thanks.